Okay, so this is my second video, and today we're going to talk about Bright. I'm using my new Logitech webcam, so this is going to look a bit different, maybe sound a bit different. But let's talk about the movie. So, one of the first things you're going to notice even if you haven't watched this movie, if you've been following and talk about it online, is that this movie is hated by the critics. Is an aggregate review on Rotten Tomatoes at 27%. So that is an abject failure as far as critical acclaim goes. This movie was hated. We're going to talk about the reasons for that a little bit later. But what is fascinating is that if you see the reviewer comments, you'll see there that 87%. That's a 60% difference. Effectively, it got nearly 9 out of 10 by just the average person who watched it. And only close to 3 out of 10 by the reviewers. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through our review, why I think the reviewers hated it and viewers loved it. But first let's talk about the movie. So what is Bright? This is going to be a spoiler review, so if you haven't seen the movie, I say put down the camera, go watch it. If you don't have Netflix, it'll cost you like $12 to get it for a month and watch it, and you get a whole bunch of access to other stuff as well. So you're not gonna. I really don't think you're gonna be disappointed if you watch this movie, depending on what you like. If you don't like a lot of swearing and a lot of action, then it's probably not your kind of movie. But if you like fantasy, you like buddy cop movies, you like action movies, and you like stuff like this, then this is gonna be a really fun movie for you to watch. My wife and I, we watched it the other night. We both liked it. We both enjoyed it. We both thought it was great. We both found it absolutely hilarious that the critics hated it. So what is this movie? This movie is an urban fantasy movie. So what do I mean by that? So I want you to think about what you would get if you crossed Bad Boys or Die Hard 3 with a Vengeance. Take Die Hard 3 with a Vengeance or Bad Boys 2 and cross it with Lord of the Rings. That's what this movie is about. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? We don't get a lot of urban fantasy movies out there. In fact, we don't get a lot of fantasy at all because fantasy is a big gamble for movie companies to get involved in. In fact, when you think about it, you can only really think of a few really popular fantasy series. We have Twilight, which is terrible. We have the Harry Potter series. We have Lord of the Rings. And then there's the occasional cult classic like Willow and Conan the Barbarian back in the 80s. Every now and then there's a fantasy movie which people might enjoy, but generally they go straight to DVD, and even those fantasy movies which make it to the cinemas often fail. So it is a risky genre, but I think this movie pulls it off. It follows two police officers, one played by Will Smith, who plays Constable Ward, and the other one played by Joel Edgerton, who plays Jacoby, and he is an orc. He's an orc who's joined the LA police force, and he is the first orc officer in American history. And it's fascinating. So what we have here is a movie where they've taken elements of buddy cop movies. Often in the buddy cop movies you get these two cops together who can't stand each other, like Riggs and Murtaugh in Lethal Weapon 1. They can't stand each other, and Murtaugh can't wait to get away from Riggs because he's afraid he's going to get him killed. This movie has this element at the start. In fact, this won't actually spoil the movie for you knowing this, even though I'm going to give away some spoilers later. But the movie starts with a scene where basically the beginning of the movie where Will Smith's character, the police officer Ward, is shot by an orc, and his partner was buying a burrito, and so he was not able to help. And the movie then skips forward to when Ward's back in action, back on the police force on his first day, and you can tell that he's just not happy about having to work with this orc called Jacoby. Now Jacoby, he's your ultimate good guy. He just wants to do the right thing. He says in this movie that he's always wanted to be a police officer. Being a police officer, having that badge means more to him than anything else. He's more loyal to his badge than he is to his race of people, the orcs. Now, why is that significant? Because effectively, the way this world is set up is you've got something which is similar to modern LA. In fact, it's very similar to modern LA, but there's big differences. You've got the elves, which they're beautiful, they're rich, they're strong, they're smart. They kind of rule the world. They're the popular ones. They're the analogs for like Hollywood celebrities, but they're much better looking than the average Hollywood celebrity. And they kind of live in the rich part of town. And then you've got at the bottom of the food chain, you've got the orcs. They're in this world. The orcs 2,000 years ago had sided with the Dark Lord. The Dark Lord had been defeated, and no one's ever let the orcs live it down. And so they kind of treat them sort of like second-class citizens, or at least lower-class citizens. It's not really a Jim Crow style racism. And what's great about this movie is it doesn't preach at you about race. It just brings it naturally into the movie so that you can see those tensions between the different people groups, which is a much better way to tell a story. And then you've got the humans who kind of are in the middle. They do a lot of the normal jobs. Most of the police force are humans, although you see an elf who's an FBI agent, or something which is similar to an FBI agent, a federal magic officer who they track down magic users called Bright. A Bright is a magic user. So that is what this movie is about. It's your classic fantasy setting. Beautiful elves, humans are just what they are, and orcs are the horrible ones down the bottom. And that's the setting of this fantastic movie called Bright. The plot of this movie is very simple. It's the classic hero's tale. You've got the plot centers around Jacoby and Ward, who have this conflict. Ward has absolutely no respect for Jacoby because he feels like he failed him. He failed to protect him, and whether you're in the police force or whether you're in the army or whenever you're in any kind of job which involves dangerous situations, you need to be able to rely on your partner, and he doesn't feel like he can. So there's already that sort of racial tension there, and on top of that, they've placed this breakdown in relationship which has happened because he didn't feel like his partner did his job in apprehending the guy who shot him. So this creates some good tension between the characters, which is brought out in humorous ways. Will Smith is fantastic as Ward. You see a little bit of a more mature and jaded version of his character in Bad Boys, except he's not as wealthy. He's not some rich playboy, but he's a weathered, confident police officer who knows what he's doing, but he still has that Will Smith charisma about him, which just makes him such a good leading man in movies. And he's fantastic. He's fantastic in this movie. And so is Joel Edgerton as Jacoby, as the orc who is his partner, is also fantastic. So in this movie, well, the plot of this movie is very simple. It's the hero's journey. These guys get caught up in a situation which is beyond their control. Their life is in danger at every point. And throughout the movie, they have to learn to work together, get along together, and actually save the day, I guess. It's very simple like that. It really did remind me of Lethal Weapon 3. Of Die Hard 3. It reminded me of the relationship between Moses and McClane. And, they're brought together in a way which they just do not like. But they learn to work together and take down the bad guys. And this is what this movie is, except it's a fantasy setting. Now, some people might really struggle with that because it looks and feels a lot like what we think of LA looking like today. I mean, I've never actually been there, but I've seen it in movies and seen it in pictures and seen it on the news. So the setting feels a little bit different to your average fantasy story. But I think that makes it fascinating. I mean, how often do we get a buddy cop movie with orcs, swords, magic, and elves that can fight like Legolas? That's what this movie does. It's action-packed, non-stop action, but the storyline is also good. So what happens is effectively, in this world, being part of a heroic story is something in which people kind of long for, at least some people kind of long for, but it hasn't happened for a long time. Everyone knows the stories of the past, 2,000 years ago. Some people believe them, some people don't really believe them. But what's fascinating is how the orc in this character, he captures what's going on straight away. They're just doing their job, patrolling the crime-ridden areas of LA in which they work. And they come across this house where there's some dodgy stuff going on. They get into a gunfight. They end up walking into the middle of this magic battle where this Bright has defeated another Bright, and they come across what's called a magic wand. And in this in this world. Only brights can carry magic wands, and brights tend to be elves. 1 in a million of these brights are humans. So really, magic is known about in this world, but it's not common in this world. And in fact, there's an entire federal police force whose job it is to track down magic users and magic devices like wands and take them off the streets and lock them away and keep people safe, because magic is seen as really powerful, really dangerous. So even in this world, the idea of magic isn't considered mundane, which makes it kind of a lot more interesting. It's not the sort of movie which is going to throw magic in your face. In that way, you could think of it as something more like Game of Thrones compared to something like Supernatural. In Supernatural, the magic is a massive part of it. It's this gritty, realistic world, but they're doing spells and all kinds of stuff from the very beginning, whereas in Game of Thrones they kind of built up slowly to it, and this movie kind of does that throughout the movie. And by the time you actually start to see magic get used in any kind of significant way, you've already bought into the very interesting and fun and action-packed storyline. So I won't give away all the plot because I don't want to spoil the whole movie for you. I'm just going to talk about certain things. So this was a fantastic and fun hero's journey, fantasy, action-packed movie. I would probably give this movie about an 8 out of 10. And here's why. So let's first talk about the performances. Will Smith and Joel Edgerton, their chemistry is great, their acting is great. You believe them as the characters they are. In fact, what's good about Jacoby's character is he comes across as the fresh-faced, eager recruit who's willing to please, looking to do a good job, and you don't even really think of him as an orc, even though he looks like one, and he definitely is one in the movie. You just see him as this wonderful, eager, trusting, good character. And Will Smith does a very good job of portraying the cop who just wants to get towards retirement, who's also a good police officer, an honest police officer, but someone who's sort of been around the ringer and is doing what he can to survive. He's got a family, he doesn't want to die. So the performances are good. The supporting cast is all good. There was no bad performances in this movie at all. As far as the special effects goes, Netflix did a really good job. Now this is a feature-length, big-budget, quality action movie. They put about $90 million into this movie. So you're not getting something which is of the quality of a straight-to-DVD movie. It's got A-grade actors, A-grade special effects. In fact, I'd give the special effects about a 7 to 7.5 out of 10. There's a couple of scenes in the movie, and you might notice them. There's one where they're in this big orc hangout, and a couple of things which are done where you can kind of see where they were stretching their budget a little bit, or where the quality isn't quite as good as you would get in some of the bigger budget movies that we see coming out from Hollywood. But this movie didn't cost $200 million to make, so it doesn't look like a $200 million movie. But it does look real. They use a lot of practical special effects, so that makes it much more believable. The world in which they're in is very easy to relate to. The dialogue in this movie is mostly good. There are some corny scenes, especially when there's this homeless character who's basically prophesying about the Dark Lord that is coming. It's really hard to write Dark Lord in a way which doesn't sound a little bit corny, because the idea of the Dark Lord is throughout so much of fantasy. There's no way to make it sound anything but corny. But this movie does a pretty good job of making you believe that there's some big baddie out there. And the goal of the bad elves in this movie, who are kind of the antagonists to the protagonists, that are causing a lot of the trouble and actually own the magic wand that's gone missing. Their goal is to bring this Dark Lord back into the world, to basically rule the world and bring it under the subjugation of evil. Classic fantasy storyline. So there is that corny element of fantasy that we're all used to, but because of the fresh setting, the good special effects, the reasonably good writing, and the great acting, it makes it an enjoyable experience. As I said, 87% of viewers who saw this movie really enjoyed it. Well, it got an 87% quality rating, is what I should say. So this movie was really enjoyed by a lot of people. So, overall, the quality of this movie is pretty good. So why did the critics pan it so much when it was done so well? Well, here's why I think they hated this movie. I was watching one reviewer and he pointed out that a lot of these reviewers live in LA. And so this movie doesn't present LA in a very positive light. In fact, it kind of presents LA in this light. You've got the privileged rich people who live in the Hollywood Hills kind of area. You've got the, your average people who do all the hard work for these rich privileged people. And then you've got the poor orcs who are kind of analogues for the way black people have sometimes been perceived by whites in America. And so they might feel like the movie's a little bit stereotypical in how it segregates the different people groups. But I really think that they've failed to recognize that this isn't so much political commentary as it is just simply how people view the fantasy world. Can you think of any fantasy genre, any fantasy stories out there? I'm sure there are some, but there are not many fantasy stories out there where the orcs are seen as equally as good as humans and elves. Often the orcs are the bad guys, or often they're corrupted by a Dark Lord of some kind, like Sauron in Lord of the Rings, or like Shiatan in The Wheel of Time. So orcs, if you were to bring orcs into the modern world and make them part of modern culture, they would generally range from gang violence through to lower income drugs through to other organized crime, because that's the kind of position which they hold in sort of the fantasy realm of stories. So that kind of makes it a little bit cliche in that sense, but that's generally how orcs are portrayed in fantasy, and I think it was quite creative to bring them into the story. We still see African American gangs in this movie, and they're portrayed in a reasonably positive light when they're having a dialogue with the police officer Ward at the beginning of the movie. They live right next to his house. There doesn't seem to be much antagonism between him and them. So we see that this movie has tried to sort of change out some of the races, some of the people groups in our society for some of the races of fantasy, which I can understand why some reasons they might not have liked this, but I thought it was done really well. But this is the main reason why I think that the critics didn't like this movie, because it doesn't preach at you. It doesn't have a political message. It's got elements of racial division in the story. Like I said, Jacoby is not liked by his fellow police officers because he's an orc. He's thought of as something less than the humans because the orcs once fought with the Dark Lord. In fact, one of the human police officers says that one of his ancestors used to kill orcs for fun because they were the bad guys, one of his Russian ancestors. So they do have elements of these tribalistic racial divides in the movie, but they don't preach at you like one sort of person is evil and oppressed and another person isn't. You've got bad guys who are orcs. You've got bad guys who are Latino gangs. You've got bad guys who are corrupt white and Asian female police officers. In fact, this movie is actually very diverse both in gender-wise, as far as the roles in which people hold in this world, and racially wise. In fact, the humans give off this real impression that race isn't an issue, because humans are humans, and humans don't like orcs, and the elves just see themselves as better than everyone else, and people just seem to go along with that. Which is kind of the way the Hollywood elite, in fact, a lot of the elite see themselves in our world anyway. So I think the main reason why critics hated this movie so much is because this movie doesn't preach at you with this message. It doesn't hit you over the head with a political agenda. It's not a social justice warrior movie which is trying to challenge us about our white privilege or anything like that. And it's exactly the opposite. It just incorporates elements of racial division into real life because they really do exist in the world, and does the best it can to tell you a good story. And the problem is with a lot of these reviewers in Hollywood is that they are often left-leaning, often to the far left, And in the far left circles, especially of the Hollywood circles and the reviewer circles in places like LA and New York and all these places where these elite left wing people spend time together, there's this real competition to out virtue signal each other about how much they can challenge the patriarchy or challenge this or challenge that. And this movie doesn't seek to do that. It just wants to tell you a great hero's journey with a diverse cast. You've got a main character who's a black man. You've got a main character who's an orc. You've got a main character who's an elf, which is white. You've got bad guys that are of all different races. This movie isn't trying to make you walk out of it feeling like you are horrible because you're a white man or you're this or you're that. This movie just wants to entertain you, give you an interesting world to think about. And I really think this is why the critics did not like this movie, because it didn't fit those virtue signaling categories that a lot of the movies today, which are lauded by the critics, really do. For example, the critics loved Star Wars The Last Jedi because it really pushed this hyper-egalitarian, hyper-feminist message. And if you notice in that movie, not one of the male characters, especially none of the white male characters, are presented in a positive light. Even Luke Skywalker, the greatest hero in fiction, is just an old, washed-out white man who regrets the abuse and degradation that he's brought into other people's life because of his bad choices. This movie doesn't try to preach at you in any way like that. It doesn't try to preach to you about animal abuse like The Last Jedi also did. It doesn't try to preach to you about any of these things. It just entertains you for 2 hours, which is a good length for a movie. It doesn't go too long. It's not too short. It finishes at a good time. It allows us an opening for a sequel, but doesn't require it. It's a self-contained story. Max Landis, who wrote this movie, did actually a really good job. I know that there's been some issues where he's been accused of some sexual assault. I can't speak to that because I don't know the situation. I just know that he did a really good job with writing this movie. So overall, like I said, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Now, I do need to say, for my Christian viewers and friends out there, if you don't like swearing, there's a bit of swearing in this movie. So I don't have an issue with seeing that in movies because, like, I was in the army, I worked in factories, I know that that's how the average person speaks, and I know that in a high-pressure situation, if your life was really in danger, you're going to use certain words that you wouldn't normally use in everyday speaking. So that's much more realistic in an action movie than PG-style language. So if you don't like swearing, you're not going to like that in this movie. It didn't really faze me much at all, although I know it will faze some people. And there is a couple of scenes with a little bit of nudity when they go through a strip club in one of the, but it's not a big part of the movie. They're in and out of that place pretty quickly because a big gunfight happens. It just feels like Hollywood needs to put nudity in every movie these days. That's Hollywood for you. They preach to us about not objectifying and then they do it themselves. Such hypocrisy. But anyway, I really enjoyed this movie. My wife really enjoyed this movie. I think if you watch it, you will really enjoy this movie. So check it out. It's on Netflix. See you later.